In 1850, the widow of Cypress Bend married her slave, and what he made her eat still haunts the county, a woman of stern piety, a man of unsettling silence. A farm with a well that was said to echo wrong. A county clerk notes household provisions are vanishing at an unfit rate. A teacher marks the sudden absence of pale, trembling children. This is how their secret finally surfaced, through a single diary page found in an attic box, 50 years too late. When a pious master commands and a silent man obeys, who truly holds the power, and what will the land itself give up to finally tell the tale? We invite you to comment with where you are watching from and your local time. We are interested to know where these accounts reach. To keep these truths from being buried, subscribe and stand for justice. The record begins not with a scream, but with the dry scratch of a quill pen on linen paper. It is found in a county probate ledger for Cypress Bend, dated 1850, where the page itself feels brittle with age, and the iron gall ink has faded to the color of a winter dusk. A young clerk, a man of careful habits and quiet disposition, is tasked with reviewing the estate of the late Jedediah Lane, a planter whose passing left his holdings to his widow. The clerk's pen pauses over an entry concerning household provisions. Most accounts are routine, marked by the predictable cycles of planting and harvest, of salt pork and cornmeal. But the Lane household is an exception. The ledger notes, in the clerk's neat cursive, that the household provisions are, quote, unusually diminished, an order for more rice, more molasses, more than any family of that size could rightly consume. It is an anomaly, a disruption in the expected order of things, and it troubles the young man. In the margin, in a script smaller and tighter than the official entry, he adds a private observation, a small act of defiance against the silence of the page. 5 words that would lie dormant for half a century. Unfit amounts, suspicion arises. That suspicion had already taken root in the damp, fertile soil of Cypress Bend. It was a place on the edge of the known world, where the solid ground gave way to murky bayous and cypress knees stood like crooked teeth in the water. News traveled slowly here, carried by flatboat and horseback, but whispers traveled faster. The subject of these whispers was the widow herself, Margaret Lane. At age 43, she was known throughout the county for 2 things: her stern, unbending piety and a recent decision that defied all social and moral logic. She had remarried. Not to another planter, not to a respectable merchant from town, but to Elijah, the man who had been her late husband's property, her bondman. In the eyes of the church, their union was a troubling curiosity. In the eyes of the law, it was a contradiction, a knot that no one cared to untangle. To her neighbors, it was a private scandal, a thing to be discussed in hushed tones over fence posts and at the general store, far from Margaret's hearing. They saw her on Sundays, her face a mask of solemnity, her Bible held tight in her gloved hands. Beside her walked Elijah, his eyes always downcast, his presence a silent challenge to the natural order of their world. He was a man built of endurance, his stillness unsettling. He never spoke unless spoken to, and even then his answers were clipped and soft, as if the words themselves cost him something he could not afford to spend. This marriage, contested and strange, sat uneasily upon the county, a simmering pot left unwatched. Away from the prying eyes of the town, in a small clapboard schoolhouse, another record was being kept. Miss Abigail Cross, the local schoolteacher, believed in the power of details. She was a woman of quiet principles, her life governed by the ringing of the school bell and the neat columns of her attendance log. It was in this log that the first real sign of trouble appeared. The 2 Lane stepchildren, Jedediah's children from a prior marriage, had always been consistent pupils. But after their stepmother's new marriage, their attendance became erratic. Miss Cross would mark them absent for a day, then 2. When they returned, they were changed. The boys' usual boisterous energy was gone, replaced by a deep-seated weariness. The girl, once quick with a smile, now seemed to flinch at any sudden movement. Both were pale, their eyes holding a haunted, vacant look that did not belong in the face of a child. Miss Cross, a woman with a keen and sympathetic eye, noted their trembling hands and the way they would push their lunch away, untouched. She would ask, gently, if they were unwell. They would only nod, offering no explanation. The pattern became undeniable. A period of absence, followed by a return in a state of depleted, hollowed-out exhaustion. It was as if something at the Cypress Bend homestead was leeching the very life from them, bit by bit. The feeling of wrongness began to spread beyond the schoolhouse. It clung to the humid air like the ever-present Spanish moss. A farmhand, hired for a season to help clear a new field on the Lane property, spoke of a strange instruction he'd been given by Elijah. He was told, in that quiet, firm voice, never to draw water from the west well. When he asked why, Elijah's only reply was that the well, quote, echoes wrong. The farmhand didn't press the matter, but he never forgot the coldness in the man's tone. Around that same time, a young delivery boy from the general store, a lad of about 14, was sent to the Lane house with a sack of flour and was never seen again. His name was simply scratched from the store's ledger, a life erased by a line of ink. The official explanation was that he must have run off, perhaps seeking fortune in a bigger city. But the folks in Cypress Bend knew their own. Boys like that didn't just vanish. A quiet dread began to settle over the community. The clerk's suspicion in the probate ledger, the teacher's concern for the pale and silent children, the farmhand's memory of the echoing well, and the scratched-out name of a missing boy, these were not separate events. They were pieces of a puzzle no one wanted to solve. A terrible logic began to form in the minds of those who paid attention. The source of the darkness was not in the swamps or the lonely roads. The hazard was the home itself. Beneath the widow's rigid piety and Elijah's suffocating silence, a hidden practice was taking hold, and the truth of what was happening at Cypress Bend was far more sinister than anyone dared to imagine. The quiet suspicion in Cypress Bend began to assemble itself into a body of proof, not in a courtroom, but on the scattered pages of ordinary life. The investigation, if it could be called that, was led by the steady hand of Miss Abigail Cross. Her school attendance log was no longer just a record of presence and absence. It had become a meticulous chart of suffering. She noted the days the Lane children were kept home, and then, upon their return, she would add small, precise notes in the margins. Thomas returned, listless and pale. Sarah complains of a bitter taste in her mouth, refuses her lunch. The pattern became undeniable. The recurring illnesses were not random afflictions caught in the schoolyard. They were tied directly to their time at the homestead. A sickness that seemed to brew within the very walls of their house, administered at the dinner table. One afternoon, after the other children had gone, Miss Cross sat with young Sarah, who was tracing patterns on a slate. The teacher asked her what she had eaten for supper the night before. The child looked up, her eyes wide and fearful, and whispered a single word, porridge. This thread of evidence, spun in the schoolhouse, found its counterpart in the dusty receipts impaled on a spindle at the general store. The proprietor, a man who prided himself on knowing the needs of every family in the county, had long found the Widow Lane's purchases peculiar. While other households bought flour, salt, and bacon, Margaret's orders were different. He unspooled the receipts for the county sheriff, a man more accustomed to settling land disputes than investigating dark whispers. The papers told a strange story. There were the expected bulk orders of molasses and rice, confirming the clerk's initial suspicion, but there were other, more troubling items. She bought alum powder, a potent astringent, in a quantity fit for a tannery, not a kitchen. She purchased laudanum, the tincture of opium, not by the small vial for a toothache, but by the bottle. The sheriff scratched his head, unable to see a crime in a woman's grocery list. But for those who were paying attention, the ingredients suggested a recipe for something other than nourishment. It was a formula for control, for inducing sickness, for dulling the senses and breaking the will. The most damning account came from a church visitor, a woman from a neighboring town who had attended a Sunday supper at the Lane house. She later recounted her experience to her sister, her voice still laced with a disquieted awe. The widow, she said, had been the very picture of hospitality, pressing food upon her guests with a chilling insistence. The centerpiece of the meal was a dark, heavy porridge, which Margaret claimed was an old family recipe. The visitor took one spoonful and found it overwhelmingly bitter, with a strange, medicinal aftertaste she could not place. She politely set her bowl aside, but she watched, horrified, as Margaret and Elijah moved around the table, their gazes fixed on the Lane children. They insisted the boy and girl finish every last bite, their voices low but unyielding. The visitor recalled the look on the children's faces, a mixture of resignation and quiet terror, as they choked down the foul-tasting meal. The phrase that had been a vague whisper now took on a terrifying specificity. It was not just about food. It was about what she made them eat. The portrait of Elijah, the silent enforcer, was filled in by a diary fragment discovered years later, tucked inside a Bible belonging to a traveling minister. The minister had spent a night at the Lane homestead, seeking shelter on his journey. He wrote of the widow's oppressive piety, but it was his description of Elijah that carried the most weight. He described a man whose subservience was a performance, a mask for something cold and watchful. His eyes, downcast, though I sensed a threat behind the meekness, the minister wrote. He moves with a purpose that is not his own, but he is no simple tool. There is a hardness in him, a compact he has made with the darkness in that house. I felt his presence not as a servant, but as a sentinel. Elijah was not merely complicit, he was the guardian of the widow's secrets, the silent hand that locked the doors and served the bowls. The picture was now complete. The school logs mapped the sickness, the receipts listed the poisons, and the visitor's memory gave testimony to the act itself. The food was the weapon, and meals were the ritual. But just as the scattered pieces of truth began to form a coherent and horrifying image, the system designed to protect the innocent collapsed into silence. A fire broke out one night at the county courthouse. It was small, contained to the records room, and quickly extinguished. The official report called it an accident, blaming a misplaced oil lamp. But when the smoke cleared, the probate ledgers for the year 1850, including the one with the clerk's prescient margin note, were gone, turned to ash. Not long after, young Sarah Lane was quietly sent away, packed off to live with distant relatives in a state 2 days' ride to the west. The only living witness who might one day speak of the bitter porridge was removed from the board. To seal the silence, nature itself intervened. That winter, the skies opened and the rivers swelled. The lowlands of Cypress Bend were swallowed by a devastating flood, washing away roads, fences, and any lingering physical evidence that might have remained. The world of Margaret and Elijah was scoured clean. With the records burned, the witness gone, and the land itself providing cover, the predator pair seemed untouchable, protected by a conspiracy of fire, water, and fear. The whispers in the county died down, not because the suspicion was gone, but because the path to justice had been entirely erased. Years passed, and the silence over Cypress Bend hardened like packed earth. The story of the widow and her silent husband faded from active concern into the realm of unsettling folklore. But truth, even when buried, has a way of leaving markers on the land. In 1858, a boundary dispute brought a county surveyor to the Lane property. While charting the lines of the homestead, he stumbled upon an anomaly not marked on any map. Beneath the main house, accessible only through a cleverly hidden trapdoor in the pantry, was a root cellar unlike any he had ever seen. Most cellars in that part of the country were simple earthen pits, cool and damp, for storing potatoes and preserves. This one was different. It was deep, lined with old brick, and possessed a formal, tomb-like quality. The air inside was stagnant and heavy with the smell of lime and something else, something acrid and decayed. At the far end of the chamber, the surveyor found several rotted wooden barrels. Tipping one over, he saw that it did not contain grain or salted meat. Instead, it was filled with a hardened mixture of spoiled meal, strange dried herbs, and a fine white powder that he recognized as quicklime. It was a place not for preservation, but for concealment. He noted the cellar on his survey, marking it as an unusual bricked enclosure, a sterile, factual description for a place that radiated a profound sense of wrongness. The cellar was sealed, its existence officially recorded, but its purpose left to fester in the margins of county documents. The deepest echoes of the cellar's secret were not found in official records, but in the fragile artifacts left behind by the children who had endured it. Decades later, a collection of old-school slates and copybooks from Miss Abigail Cross's tenure was discovered in the attic of the old schoolhouse. Among them were drawings made by Sarah Lane before she was sent away. They were the typical drawings of a child, a house, a tree, a smiling Sunday, but scattered among these were other, more disturbing images. She had drawn stick figures of a boy and a girl, their bodies bent over large, dark bowls. From each bowl, a black spiral rose up, like a plume of noxious smoke. In another drawing, a small figure was depicted sleeping not in a bed, but under the floorboards of the house, a detail that chilled the observer to the bone. It was the visual testimony Sarah had been unable to give in words, a child's map of her own torment. These drawings, stored away and forgotten, became a silent chorus, whispering a truth that the adults of Cypress Bend had chosen to ignore. The black spirals in the bowls were a clear depiction of the bitter porridge, a poison administered not to kill the body, but to crush the spirit. Just as the community began to forget, the central figures of the drama made their final quiet exits from the stage. One morning, Elijah was simply gone. There was no public announcement, no formal process, but the word spread that Margaret had quietly arranged for his manumission papers to be filed. He was a free man. He vanished from Cypress Bend without a word, leaving behind no trace of his passing, no clue as to where he had gone. His departure was as silent and unsettling as his presence had been. A few months later, the town learned that the widow Margaret Lane herself had died. The cause of death was officially recorded as fever, a vague and common diagnosis that served as a convenient blanket for any unexplained passing. There was no suspicion noted in the record, no questions asked. She was buried in the churchyard, her gravestone marking her as a respectable, God-fearing woman. With Elijah gone and Margaret in the ground, the story was officially over. The root cellar was permanently sealed with stone and mortar by the new owners of the property, who wanted no part of the homestead's lingering bad air. For the next half a century, the tale of the widow of Cypress Bend existed only as a cautionary phrase, a piece of local lore passed down among the old families. When a child was being picky about their food, a grandmother might say with a dark look, "Be grateful for what you have. Don't take food from Cypress Bend." The words were a warning, a coded reference to a time of hidden evil, a reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who invite you to their table. The law had failed, the authorities had looked away, and the truth was sealed in silence. The moral weight of what had happened fell not on the shoulders of the legal system, but on the fragile persistence of memory, a burden carried by the community itself. Justice, it seemed, was not to be found in a courthouse, but in the hushed, enduring power of a story that refused to completely die. Lie, white space, pre-wrap. The arrival of a new century brought with it a hunger for looking back, for sorting through the artifacts of a bygone era. In the year 1903, the old Lane house, having passed through several hands, fell to a granddaughter of the family, a practical young woman named Eliza. Charged with the duty of clearing out the clutter of generations, she ascended into the dusty, suffocating heat of the attic. There, tucked away in a dark corner beneath the eaves, she found a small, leather-bound box, its surface filmed with a half-century of grime. Inside, preserved in the dry, still air, was a collection of papers. They were loose diary pages, written in a stark, severe hand she recognized from her great-aunt Margaret's letters. The pages were pressed together, fused by time and mildew into a solid block. With painstaking care, Eliza began to separate them, steaming them gently over a kettle until the brittle paper released its hold. As the words emerged from the faded ink, she found herself reading not the pious reflections of a respectable widow, but a confession. It was a late-life admission, a conversation with a god Margaret Lane had fashioned in her own cruel image. The lines were short, fragmented, but their meaning was brutally clear. One entry, dated from the winter after her remarriage, read, "The boy resists the portion. He spits it out. Elijah held him steady." Another page contained an even more chilling justification. "He says they must eat it to obey. God will not see what is done in the name of order." It was the key, the Rosetta Stone, to the entire sordid affair. The diary did not name the ingredients, but it laid bare the motive. This was not about poison in the traditional sense. It was about the systematic destruction of will. The bitter porridge, the strange concoctions, were instruments of control, designed to make the children and the servants docile, obedient, and too sick to resist. Margaret's piety was not a contradiction to her cruelty. It was the engine that drove it. She believed she was enacting a divine mandate, imposing a rigid, suffocating order on her household, with Elijah as her unwavering instrument. This was not a partnership of equals. The power dynamic, so clear in the diary, was one of absolute command and absolute obedience. Margaret was the mind, and Elijah was the hand. She saw it as her right, her duty, to break them, and in her own twisted scripture, she saw no sin. Eliza, holding the fragile, spotted pages in her hands, felt the weight of a truth that had been buried for 53 years. She was the first person to truly understand the nature of the evil that had transpired in that house. The phrase, "what he made her eat," was wrong. The ghost that haunted the county had the wrong pronoun. It was Margaret's command all along. The rediscovery of the diary sent a shockwave through the quiet, settled memory of the community. Its contents reached the ears of an old man living out his final years at the local Veterans Hall. He was the same man who, as a cautious young clerk, had made the fateful note in the probate ledger all those years ago. Now, stooped and frail, his memory of that time was as sharp as a newly honed blade. He recalled his youthful suspicion, the feeling that the widow's excessive orders for provisions were a sign of something deeply amiss. He remembered the quiet fear in the courthouse, the unspoken rule that certain families were not to be scrutinized too closely. His testimony, delivered in a wavering but certain voice, gave the diary an unshakable foundation of credibility. His early doubts, dismissed and then burned away, had resurfaced as a crucial piece of corroborating evidence. The old clerk, who had spent his life among the quiet dust of records, had his moment of vindication. His small act of defiance in the margin had finally found its purpose. The chain of evidence, broken for so long, began to mend. The clerk's memory validated the diary, and the diary, in turn, explained the unsettling artifacts that had long puzzled the county. The teacher's logs of pale and trembling children, the visitor's tale of a bitter meal, the surveyor's discovery of the bricked-up cellar filled with spoiled meal and lime, each piece now locked into place, forming a single, horrifying narrative. Elijah, once a victim of a cruel system, had been transformed by Margaret into its enforcer. In the suffocating confines of the Cypress Bend homestead, he had made a terrible choice. To survive, he would become the vessel for her cruelty. His silence was not weakness, but a shield and a weapon. He administered the portions, held down the struggling children, and guarded the secrets of the cellar, not out of malice, but out of a desperate, twisted loyalty to the woman who held the power of life and death over him. The true horror of Cypress Bend was not just the abuse, but the insidious way that power could corrupt both the master and the one they mastered, turning the entire household into a closed system of terror with Margaret as its unholy god, and Elijah as her high priest. With Margaret dead and Elijah long vanished, there could be no trial, no judge, no jury. The laws of man had been outlasted by the crime, but justice is not always a matter of gavels and courtrooms. Sometimes it is simply a matter of exposure. The story, now fortified by the diary and the old clerk's memory, could no longer be contained by whispers. A county historian, a man with a deep respect for the unwritten records of his community, took it upon himself to assemble the facts. He spoke with Eliza, the granddaughter. He visited the Veterans Hall to hear the clerk's account. He meticulously reviewed the old-school logs and the surveyor's map with its cryptic note about a bricked enclosure. The result was a small pamphlet, plainly printed and bound, titled simply, "The Cypress Bend Account." It was not a bestseller, nor was it intended to be. Its distribution was local, its purpose singular: to place the truth on the record. Copies were left at the church, passed between pews after the Sunday service. They were discussed in quiet tones at the general store and read aloud in hushed gatherings of veterans, men who understood the importance of an accurate accounting. The shame of Margaret Lane and the dark complicity of Elijah were finally laid bare, not in a court of law, but in the court of public memory. The carefully constructed facade of the pious widow was systematically dismantled, replaced by the portrait of a methodical predator. Then, as if to provide the final, irrefutable piece of evidence, the land itself offered its testimony. In the spring of 1909, the Cypress Bend lowlands were ravaged by the worst flood in living memory. The rivers swelled, broke their banks, and consumed the countryside in a torrent of brown, churning water. The old Lane homestead, sitting on a slight rise, was spared the worst of the destruction, but the foundations were battered and scoured by the relentless current. When the waters finally receded, they left behind a landscape altered and revealed. The ground around the house had been stripped away, and a corner of the old foundation had collapsed, exposing the sealed root cellar to the light of day for the first time in over 50 years. The mortar, weakened by decades of damp and now assaulted by the flood, had given way. Inside the dark chamber, the floodwaters had churned the contents into a grim tableau. There were the shattered remains of heavy pottery bowls, their dark glaze visible in the mud. There were the bones of small animals, chickens, a cat, a testament to cruel experiments or punishments. And mixed with the mud and decay were the undeniable white streaks of scorched lime, confirming the surveyor's long-forgotten report. The land had held the evidence in its belly, and at last it had given it up. The physical proof now lay exposed, validating every word in the diary, every fear in the children's drawings. The discovery of the cellar's contents was the final catalyst. The time for whispers was over. The time for a public declaration had come. In the autumn of 1910, a formal meeting was held at the Veterans Hall. It was a solemn affair, attended by the leading figures of the community, the old families who carried the memory of Cypress Bend in their blood. The historian stood before them, his pamphlet in hand. Eliza, the granddaughter who had unsealed the past, sat in the front row. With a steady voice, the historian read the account from beginning to end, detailing the clerk's suspicion, the teacher's logs, the visitor's supper, the diary's confession, and the final, grim evidence from the unearthed cellar. When he finished, a profound silence filled the room. The evil that had festered in secret for so long had finally been named, catalogued, and condemned by the community itself. From that day forward, the name Cypress Bend became a permanent part of the local vocabulary, a synonym for hidden cruelty, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide behind a pious face and a silent obedience. Justice, it turned out, was not a judge's gavel, but the slow, grinding pressure of memory. It was the persistence of records, the courage of a witness, and the eventual, undeniable testimony of the land itself. The widow's calculated cruelty and Elijah's silent enforcement were at last dragged into the light, and the county, cleansed by the telling, could finally truly be warned.